Okay, this presentation concerns the Iranian hegemony of the classical era. They don't get enough attention, and probably the most significant cultural form, civilization of the classical era for the purposes of the global world. Their arc extended, as you can see, all the way from Europe, all the way from the Danube at its peak, all the way across the Middle East, all the way through the Iranian plateau, all the way to the Indus in South Asia, and then northward up into the steppe lands, all the way to the Pamir Mountains. And so we're all the way to the borders of China as well. So this long arc, maybe 5,000 miles total. At its peak, it may be a population of 30 million people under the hegemony of the Persian Empire. And we have to start by recognizing that the Persians were a tribal element within the broader Iranian populations, and they were not the first to be dominant. First, according to Herodotus, it was the Medes who were sort of to the north at Ecbatana, the region just to the south of the Elburz Mountains. But there are others we could mention: the Parthians, the Hyrcanians, the Aracosians, the Arians, and in fact, as an arc, they extended upward along the Iranian plateau into Afghanistan and north up into the region today of the Turkmenistan and the various principalities of Central Asia. Now, when we get to that region, you have to recognize what was Iranian at that point? At this point, we're in an area of the world where multiple, we say, range of ethnic diversity. We have Turkic peoples north of the Pamir Mountains and Tian Mountains. This is presumably the origin of the Turkic population. There's something that the Iranians have to kind of merge with. Also, we get to Asian populations, particularly the Mongolian populations, the Sungnu, the Yichek, these various Asian peoples also came westward across the Pamir Mountains and infiltrated this region. And so they become a part of this as well. And we have Dravidian peoples, Aramaean peoples. And so I like to say that Afghanistan, that region, sort of the axis for the populations of Eurasia. Everything seems to evolve around it. It becomes a giant soup, a very hybrid population. Seems to be primarily sort of the Iranian overlay. The leadership was this population of elites that were the various tribal leadership of the Iranian people. They intermarried extensively, um, but the base population was what it was, and we have to recognize that factor in it. Another feature to realize that we see is that we don't see, I mean, there's going to be rivalry in a royal sort of hegemonial system to begin with. Every king of the Persian Empire, basically, when he ascended to the throne, he would be tested by his relatives and cousins for his worth to be the king. So that's a typical phenomenon. But what we know is that, for example, according to Herodotus, we have the Medes, and the Medes were the ones who pushed into Mesopotamia, defeated the Assyrians, sort of established. They were the ones who pushed all the way to the Aegean. The Greek population in the mainland, this is the first Iranian population they came in contact with. And so all Persians were Medes to the writers of classical Greek, because that was the first. But we know that when Cyrus overthrew his father Astyages and became the new king of the empire, we don't hear that all these other tribal elites were all that disgruntled with it. And it probably reflects the fact intense intermarriage that occurred, the kind of step up ladder system in bureaucracies. They have, I guess what I'm trying to say is they have more affinity than not, a greater interest in being together than not. Terrain, one of the most diverse ecological regions of the world. Here is, if you went from Mesopotamia, these are the Iranian gates that lead up from Mesopotamia. This is an example of the classical road system, as you can see. It was simply for pack animals getting up into the mountains, into the plateau of Iran. When you came through the gates, not too far, you encountered this rock face, and it was here that Darius I put up his famous inscription, Bayestun inscription. And here is a view of the relief and what it shows. Darius I reigned from 522 to 486 BC. It shows Darius leading a bunch of prisoners. You can see them all there in chains with chains or ropes around their necks and their hands tied behind their backs to the right, to Ahura Mazda, the great positive God, the God of light of the Zoroastrian faith. And below was inscribed his record in Old Persian, in cuneiform, and in Aramaic. And this, it was here that Sir Henry Rawlinson suspended himself from ropes, and he transcribed these inscriptions. This was the break, the transcribing that enabled scholars to break cuneiform as a written text technology and read it. So we owe it to this particular inscription. Now, what it's actually telling us is sort of an apology by Darius. He was not in direct line of Cyrus and his son Cambyses, but a revolution broke out with the death of Cambyses, and a collateral line had to step in. And he's kind of explaining why he had to do this and suppress his various rivals and establish authority once again. And then he lists the various additions that he made to the empire. So we have a list of the various satrapies, the provinces, some 30-odd provinces. A wealth of information, shall we say. So very useful for a number of reasons. Now, Iran itself, as I was saying, is kind of diverse. The central plains are basically highly arid, very desert-like. We have the great story of the campaigns between Antigonus I and Eumenes and the successors of Alexander fighting out here, commanding giant armies out here. And really, the battle occurred where it did because both sides ran out of water. So there's one aspect to this. And it's interesting here, and again, I've never been there, so these are old photos I've got from books. And I love this photo because, again, it shows the terrain of central Iran. It shows on the right you have the oil pipelines of today, and on the left you have the ancient irrigation system, not irrigation system that goes back to antiquity. So you get runoff from the mountains, and they would extend it out into the arid zones through these underground canals, where so the water wouldn't evaporate. With various holes, they could use lever systems to pull water around, irrigate the land. And there were three principal capitals for the Achaemenid line, started by Cyrus II in 559 BC. The first was the ancient Median capital of Ecbatana. This is the most remote of the three, and as a result, it was probably one of the main treasury depots because it was hard to get to in this way. Then there was Persepolis, the great palace system complex that was constructed by Darius and Xerxes. And then the third one was Susa, the ancient Elamite capital in Mesopotamia. And the Persian kings would migrate, rotate seasonally between these three palaces. And when they moved, the entire entourage went with them. So it was a giant parade of thousands of people. They might even bring their zoo, for example. So they would migrate through the terrain. They would meet local people, not just the emperor, but his wives, his courtiers, his relatives. And it was a way in which they engaged and connected with the population at the local level this way. And again, it also, when they migrated, they lived in giant pavilion tents and symbolizing their ancient connection to pastoral lifestyles, which was the heart of the Persian or Iranian peoples. They were pastoralists. They rode horses. They and the Turkic populations in Central Asia were probably responsible for harnessing horses first with chariots and then riding on horseback. And the Persians were famous for their massive cavalries, as many as 30 or 40,000, we are told, at the Battle of Gaugamela, for example. So this is Ecbatana. And in the general vicinity, here we have one of the great mosques of Isfahan. And we're looking at the Elburz Mountains. You get up to the north of Iran, and you get into alpine situations with snow-capped mountains. And then as you go over the mountains to the Caspian, it becomes almost subtropical, right in there, very narrow sliver. of rich, humid terrain. But then you go eastward out into Arabia, into Afghanistan, then we get into very, very arid terrain as well. Mountains and aridness combined. Cyrus himself founded his capital after defeating Astyages, Argadai, and this became the ancestral burial place intended to be. So here we have the tomb of presumably Cyrus himself. There was a palace, you see in the center, and then a fire altar, supposedly of Zoroaster, commemorating the Zoroastrian religion as well. And although there is this inscription, the actual words of the inscription on the tomb of Cyrus, and there's various arguments as to what it's based on. Maybe Herarchean example, maybe Lydian example, step tomb here. But supposedly, according to sources, the inscription went, "Passers-by, I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians an empire, and was king of Asia. Grudge me not, therefore, this monument." Darius, having defeated all his rivals, decided he needed a bigger. And again, we're looking at a kind of pattern we can take all the way back to the Bronze Age, a new palace complex. And so he built the city of the Persians. This was built by Darius I and by his son Xerxes, so 486 to 465. So between 522 and 465, this complex was constructed. And it's constructed on a giant terrace built into the hillside, as you can see, with fortifications running up the hill. We're told that it was fortified. Although the terrace itself doesn't reveal any evidence of fortifications. In the hills directly behind it were the tombs of various kings. The complex itself, again, even this is somewhat debated as to what its purpose was. Some of the views, aerial views of this, and what we're looking at in particular are two giant hyposteel halls. We have the one to the top in the center and the one lower down. Hyposteel halls, again, we could take this back to Egypt. In Iran, it was called the Apadana, the meeting place, the reception hall of the emperor. So one is believed to have been constructed by Darius and completed by Xerxes. And then the smaller one, there's various debates as to whether it was a throne room or his residence. And there are other structures on the terrace. There's been some debate. I think the general acceptance today is that this was the palace complex. And so the emperor and his court would reside here, his scribes. Some have argued that no, in fact, they lived off of this. This was purely for ritual and ceremonial purposes, and so it would be empty at nighttime. I leave that to some reconstructions of it. In addition, let's go on to the next one. Three-dimensional view of this. And there's the points, the buildings I commented on. And in addition to the terrace complex, around it was a rich, lush garden. And the Persian word for this was paradisios. This is where we get the word paradise from. There's a main theme going on here, and that was this is the capital of the Persian Empire. So it was to convey a sense of the wealth of its empire. So art that we're going to see here is a composite, a hybrid form to sort of represent the various styles of art of all the subject peoples of the empire. And at the same time, the gardens extended. They made a point of importing plants from all the various satrapies, from all the various provinces, and create this lush garden, again, watered by a canal system, to kind of convey the richness, the hybridization and the richness of the Iranian hegemony in the Persian Empire. So it's sort of, a mix, a sort of a mixture, and this is the message that they try to convey in their art and in their symbolism. Add, for example, pistachio nuts are believed to have been imported maybe from the Indus Valley all the way to Asia Minor as a result of the pollination view of the Iranian Empire. Here's another view. I should point out the terrace is hyposteel hall was some 200 feet at its base, and its columns extended about 60 feet up and supported the great roof rafters, primarily made with cedar beams from Lebanon. Had the grand stairway, and the stairway was famous for its release of the immortal 10,000 warriors, bodyguards of the Persian king, but also it portrays subject notables who were bringing tribute to the kings in their actual native garb. The detail of this is essential. Again, here's the Takara, or the throne room of Darius. And here's this example of the hybrid nature of Achaemenid art. Again, notice the Assyrian-like face of the bust there with the beard and the woven hairdo, the almond-shaped eye. We have on the left, we have the doorposts that are Assyrian griffins, essentially. We have these great column entablature, the column capitals that are, they could be horses, they could be cows, they could be human, they could be griffins. You have this sort of capital design there of the lotus plants, which would have come originally from Egypt, but it was also an Ionian trait in their architecture. So the Aegean. Some release of the kings of Xerxes. Here he is on the left. He's being shaded and fanned by his attendants. And doorpost entrance into various rooms of the palace. He's slaying a lion. Here he is in his throne. And again, here are various warriors of his forces in their native garb. And the imperial tombs cut into the rock behind them, one of which is known as that of Artaxerxes II. And we can take it out from there. So if we move out into Herat in Afghanistan, we have the remains of one of Alexander's fortresses that he built when he reopened the highway across Afghanistan in his campaigns in 329 to 324 BC. We have here is the remains of his fortress Alexandria in Arabia. Again, all his colonies he named after himself. And then the other one, Arakosia at Kandahar, so now in eastern Afghanistan, but south of the mountains from Kabul. And so just again, bear in mind the extent, the reach. What does this mean in some respects? The main respect is trade throughout this region could have been conveyed by anybody who could speak Iranian. So you have this common cultural link, common language link that enables ideas, people, material to move some 5,000 miles from the Mediterranean all the way out to the borders of China and to the Indus. And then also ideas, we have to bear in mind that Zoroastrian religion, one of the great religions of the Axial Age in this monotheistic sort of trend. It's important to recognize, according to tradition, that Zoroaster himself came from Bactria. This is out in north of the Hindu Kush Mountains in the northern part of Afghanistan. And this became the dominant religious worldview of the entire Iranian elite. So, is there a center to this, or did it sort of move back and forth? It just shows what I'm talking about, this sense of hegemony and identity extended in a dispersed rural manner across a broad range